I won't let him destroy another woman the way he destroyed my grandmother. The words escaped my lips as I stared at my reflection in the guest house bathroom mirror, my hands trembling as I held the restraining order papers. At 52, I had learned that some battles choose you, whether you're ready or not. Through the window, I could see Frank's beaten up pickup truck parked in my mother's driveway, the same truck that had carried away Grandma Eleanor's antique furniture piece by piece 3 years ago. My phone buzzed with another threatening text. You think you're smart, Kate, but family always wins. Not this time, I thought, remembering the promise I'd made at Grandma's bedside. Not this time. Flashback 3 months earlier, the afternoon tea service was Mom's attempt at maintaining the illusion of family harmony. Patricia Morrison, 72 and still trying to control every family narrative, poured Earl Grey into her best china cups with the precision of a former bank manager who'd never quite retired from managing people's lives. Catherine, dear, we need to discuss Frank's situation, she began, not meeting my eyes. The familiar weight of disappointment settled in my chest. At 52, I should have been immune to that particular tone, but some childhood wounds never fully heal. I set down my cup carefully, the same way I'd learned to handle everything in this family with measured control. What situation, Mom? His third divorce is final next week. The legal fees have been substantial. She dabbed her lips with a napkin, a gesture I recognized as her way of avoiding difficult truths. He needs somewhere to stay while he gets back on his feet. The guest house. Of course. It always came back to the guest house. I'd been living there for 10 years, ever since my own divorce from David. Those walls had witnessed my tears over his infidelity, my struggles as a single mother putting my son Michael through college, and my early retirement from teaching when the stress of family obligations became too much. But most importantly, they held my memories of Grandma Eleanor, who'd been the only one to truly see me. The guest house isn't available, I said quietly. Mom's perfectly plucked eyebrows arched in that familiar expression of polite disbelief. Don't be difficult, Catherine. It's just temporary, and Frank is family. Family. The word had lost most of its meaning over the years, worn thin by constant manipulation and misuse. Flashback 15 years earlier. I was 37, still married to David, still believing that family loyalty meant endless sacrifice. Grandma Eleanor had just been diagnosed with her first stroke, and I'd volunteered to help manage her finances while she recovered. Just until I'm steady on my feet again, Katie, she'd said, squeezing my hand with fingers that trembled slightly. You're the only one I trust with this. Frank had been charming then, stopping by regularly to check on Mom, always with a sob story and a promise to pay back just a small loan. I'd watched the numbers in her accounts dwindle, made excuses when she asked about discrepancies, believed his explanations because it was easier than confronting the truth. The day I found Grandma crying over her jewelry box, empty except for costume pieces Frank had substituted for her grandmother's pearls, was the day something fundamental shifted inside me. He said they needed cleaning, she whispered, her voice broken. He promised he'd bring them back. I'd held her while she cried, making a silent vow I wouldn't understand the full weight of for years to come. Present the confrontation begins. Frank needs stability, Mom continued, her voice taking on that familiar guilt-inducing tone that had worked so effectively throughout my childhood. After everything he's been through, everything he's put himself through, I corrected, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. And everything he's put this family through. Mom's teacup rattled against its saucer. That's unfair, Catherine. He's had some bad luck, but we don't abandon family when they're down. Bad luck. As if 3 failed marriages, job losses due to chronic absenteeism, and a gambling addiction that had cost him 2 houses were simply matters of unfortunate timing. The sound of tires on gravel made us both look toward the window. Frank's pickup truck pulled into the driveway, engine coughing black smoke. He'd aged hard in the 3 years since Grandma's funeral, his face more weathered, his shoulders permanently hunched from carrying the weight of his failures. He's here, Mom announced unnecessarily, rising to smooth her skirt. I invited him for tea so we could all discuss this together. Like a family meeting, I thought bitterly. Like we were all equal participants in this decision. Flashback Frank's background. Frank Morrison had been the golden boy once star quarterback in high school, full scholarship to state college, engagement to the banker's daughter. But somewhere between his sophomore year and his first arrest for drunk driving, the golden boy had tarnished. His parents, my grandparents, had bailed him out repeatedly, financing his second chances until their retirement fund ran dry. When they died within 6 months of each other, Frank had moved in with Grandma Eleanor temporarily, a temporary arrangement that lasted 5 years and cost her nearly everything. The construction jobs came and went, usually ending when his supervisor discovered tools missing or when Frank simply stopped showing up. The marriages followed a similar pattern of passionate beginnings, gradual financial drain, explosive endings with restraining orders and custody battles he never had the money to fight. But Frank possessed a particular kind of charm that made people want to save him. He could make you believe that this time would be different, that he learned from his mistakes, that all he needed was one more chance to prove himself worthy of the second chances he'd already squandered. Mom had fallen for it every time. Even I had, until Grandma's tearful confessions opened my eyes to the scope of his manipulation. Present Frank's arrival. Frank knocked 3 times, then let himself in without waiting for an answer, a behavior that had always annoyed me but which everyone else seemed to accept as part of his casual charm. "They're my two favorite ladies," he announced, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness that set my teeth on edge. At 68, he was still handsome in a weathered way, with silver hair that fell boyishly across his forehead and blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "Frank," I acknowledged without rising from my chair. He moved to hug me, but I remained seated, hands folded in my lap. The moment stretched awkwardly until Mom jumped in to fill the silence. "Catherine and I were just discussing your living situation," she said, pouring him tea without asking if he wanted any. "I explained that the guest house would be perfect while you get settled." Frank's eyes lit up with that familiar hunger I'd learned to recognize. "That's generous, Katie. I always loved that little place. Remember when you were a kid and I'd stay there on weekends? We'd build blanket forts and I'd tell you stories about dragons and princesses." I remembered different things. I remembered him bringing women there while Grandma thought he was job hunting. I remembered the smell of marijuana and cheap wine, the loud parties that kept her awake, the borrowing of her car that left her stranded when she needed to get to doctor's appointments. "I remember," I said simply. "It'll be just like old times," Frank continued, settling into the chair across from me with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Maybe I can help you with some of the maintenance. That porch has been sagging for years." The porch he'd broken during one of his drunken episodes, stumbling through the railing on his way back from the main house at 3 in the morning. Inner monologue, Kate's preparation. For 10 years, I'd been documenting everything. Bank statements, legal records, police reports, medical records from Grandma's hospitalizations. What had started as my way of processing grief had evolved into something more systematic, a comprehensive record of Frank's pattern of financial abuse and manipulation. I'd learned about elder financial abuse from Vicky Chen, my friend from high school who'd become a lawyer specializing in family law. During our monthly coffee dates, she'd help me understand the legal implications of Frank's behavior, the ways the system could be used to protect vulnerable family members. The guest house deed had been Grandma Eleanor's final gift, transferred to me legally 2 months before her death when she had a rare moment of clarity between morphine doses. "He'll try to take it," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible over the hospital machines. "Don't let him, Katie. It's yours. It's your sanctuary, just like it was mine." I'd spent 3 years since her death preparing for this moment, knowing it would come eventually. Frank always came back when he needed something, and he always started with the most vulnerable family member, in this case, Mom, whose early-stage dementia was making her increasingly susceptible to his manipulation. Present the refusal. "Actually, Frank, that won't be possible," I said, interrupting his enthusiastic planning of his return to the guest house. "I'm living there, and I intend to continue living there." The room went quiet except for the ticking of Mom's antique metal clock, a gift from Grandma Eleanor that Frank had tried to sell during one of his financial crises. "But surely you could move back to your old room," Mom suggested, her voice taking on that wheedling tone she used when she wanted to avoid conflict. "Jennifer's children are grown now, so there's plenty of space in the main house." Jennifer, my younger sister, the successful real estate agent who lived across town with her architect husband and their 2 teenagers. Jen had mastered the art of loving our family from a comfortable distance, close enough to avoid guilt but far enough to avoid the messy reality of Frank's repeated crises. No, Mom. I won't be moving. Frank's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Katie, I know we've had our differences, but I'm really trying to turn things around this time. Dr. Martinez says I'm making real progress with my addiction issues. Dr. Martinez was the court-ordered therapist Frank had been seeing since his last DUI. I'd called the office and learned that Frank had missed the last 6 appointments. I'm glad you're getting help, I said diplomatically. But that doesn't change the fact that the guest house is my home. Your home? Frank's voice carried a note of genuine surprise, as if the concept of me having my own space, my own life, was somehow foreign to him. But it's always been family property. We all used it growing up. No, Frank. You used it. The rest of us were never invited. Flashback Grandma Eleanor's stories. During her final months, when the pain medication made her more talkative than usual, Grandma Eleanor had shared stories I'd never heard before. Stories about buying the guest house property with her teacher's pension, about wanting a space where she could retreat from the chaos of raising 3 children largely alone after Grandpa died young. Your grandfather was a good man, but he never understood my need for quiet, she told me one afternoon as we sat in her hospital room. After he passed, I thought I'd finally have peace. But then Frank started visiting, started needing things. She described years of manipulation, of Frank convincing her that family meant never saying no, never setting boundaries, never protecting herself from the people who claimed to love her while systematically destroying her financial security. I enabled him, she'd admitted, tears rolling down her cheeks. I thought I was helping, but I was just making it possible for him to hurt me and everyone else. Don't make my mistakes, Katie. Some people can't be saved, and trying to save them will drown you both. Present the escalation. This is ridiculous, Frank said, standing up abruptly and beginning to pace Mom's living room. We're family. We help each other. I've been down on my luck, but I'm not asking for charity. I'll pay rent. With what money? I wanted to ask, but I held my tongue. How much rent? I asked instead. Frank paused in his pacing, clearly not having expected this question. Well, we'd have to work something out. Maybe I could do maintenance work instead of cash until I get my first paycheck from the new job. What new job? Another pause. I've got several prospects. Really good ones. The same prospects he'd been pursuing for the past 3 years, no doubt. Mom looked between us, her expression growing increasingly distressed. Children, please. We're family. Surely we can work something out. We're working something out, I said, standing up and smoothing my blouse. Frank is going to find somewhere else to live, and I'm going to continue living in my home. Your home? Frank's voice rose, and I caught a glimpse of the anger that had contributed to his 3 restraining orders. That guest house belongs to this family. You can't just claim it because you've been squatting there for a few years. Squatting. Interesting choice of words from someone who'd never paid rent anywhere he'd lived. Actually, Frank, I can. Because Grandma Eleanor left it to me. The revelation, the silence that followed was profound. Mom's teacup slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the saucer. Frank stopped pacing entirely, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, rage. That's impossible, Mom said finally. Mother left everything to be managed by the family. I have her will. You have a will, I corrected. But the guest house was never part of the main estate. Grandma bought it separately with her teaching pension, and she transferred ownership to me 2 months before she died. I pulled out my phone and showed them the digital copy of the deed, properly notarized and filed with the county. I'd been carrying it for 3 years, waiting for this moment. Frank lunged for the phone, but I pulled it back smoothly. This is bullshit, he snarled. She was on drugs. She wasn't competent to make legal decisions. She was competent enough to arrange for 3 doctors to certify her mental state, I replied calmly. She was competent enough to make a video explaining her decision. And she was competent enough to make sure every document was properly witnessed and notarized. Mom was shaking her head slowly, like someone trying to wake up from a bad dream. Why didn't she tell me? She tried to. multiple times. You always change the subject. Flashback, the video testament. Recording Grandma Eleanor's video had been one of the hardest things I'd ever done. She'd insisted on doing it herself, propping herself up in her hospital bed despite the obvious pain, wearing the blue cardigan I'd bought her for her 85th birthday. "I'm making this recording because I know what will happen after I'm gone," she'd said, looking directly into my phone's camera. "Frank will try to take the guest house, just like he tried to take everything else. My daughter Patricia will enable him, just like she always has. And Catherine will be expected to sacrifice herself for family peace, just like I did for too many years." Her voice had grown stronger as she continued, drawing on reserves of determination I hadn't seen since her stroke. "The guest house was bought with my own money, earned from 35 years of teaching. It was my refuge, my sanctuary, my one space in this world that was truly mine. I'm leaving it to Catherine because she understands what it means to need sanctuary. She understands what it means to be the family scapegoat, the one everyone expects to give and give and give until there's nothing left." She'd paused to catch her breath, then looked directly into the camera with an intensity that still gave me chills. "Frank, if you're watching this, know that I see you clearly for the first time in decades. You are not a victim of circumstances. You are a predator who targets your own family members, and I will not enable your behavior from beyond the grave. The guest house is Catherine's. Legally, morally, and permanently. Accept it and move on with your life." Present, the confrontation intensifies. "I want to see this supposed video," Frank demanded, his face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. I queued up the file and set my phone on the coffee table where they could both see it. Watching Frank's face as Grandma Eleanor methodically destroyed his narrative of victimhood was almost worth the 10 years of waiting. When the video ended, Mom was crying silently. Frank was staring at the blank screen with an expression I'd never seen before, something between grief and rage, recognition and denial. "She was bitter," he said finally. "Bitter and manipulated. You turned her against me." "I didn't need to turn her against you, Frank. Your actions did that." "What actions?" His voice was rising again, and I saw Mom flinch. "I tried to help her. I visited her. I was there when no one else was." "You were there to take things," I said quietly. "Her jewelry, her savings, her car, her peace of mind. You were there when it benefited you." "That's not true." I pulled out a folder I'd been keeping in my purse, bank statements, police reports, hospital records. "Should we go through the documentation? The times you borrowed money from her accounts? The jewelry you sold while she was in the hospital? The car you crashed and left her without transportation to her chemotherapy appointments?" Frank grabbed for the folder, but I held it out of reach. "These are copies. I have originals in a safe deposit box, along with witness statements from 3 nurses, 2 social workers, and her oncologist." Inner monologue, the long game. People always underestimated me. My ex-husband David had called me predictably passive during our divorce proceedings. My colleagues at the high school had seen me as the quiet teacher who never caused trouble. Even my own family had categorized me as the dependable one, the one who would always be there to clean up messes and absorb abuse without complaint. But being underestimated had its advantages. It meant people didn't pay attention to what I was actually doing while they assumed I was doing nothing. It meant they didn't notice when I started documenting their behavior, didn't realize when I began building cases against them. Teaching high school had actually prepared me well for dealing with Frank. I'd learned to recognize the patterns of manipulative behavior, the ways certain students would try to charm, threaten, or guilt their way out of consequences. I'd learned that the most effective response was often the calmest one: firm boundaries, clear expectations, and follow through without drama or emotional investment. The difference was that, unlike my students, Frank had never had to face real consequences for his behavior. Every time he crossed a line, some family member had rushed in to smooth things over, to make excuses, to enable him to continue his pattern without learning or growing. Grandma Eleanor's death had been his last free pass. Everything after that was documented, witnessed, and legally actionable. Present Mom's breakdown. "I don't understand," Mom said, her voice small and confused. "Why would Mother do this without telling me? Why would she make such a big decision without including the family? Because including the family meant including Frank, I said gently. And including Frank meant having her wishes overruled by his needs, just like always. Mom looked older than her 72 years, fragile in a way that made my heart ache despite my anger. The early signs of dementia that had made her an easy target for Frank's manipulation also made her genuinely confused by complex emotional situations. But we're supposed to take care of each other, she said, the phrase sounding rehearsed, like something she'd been taught to believe without ever examining its truth. Taking care of each other goes both ways, Mom. It means Frank should have taken care of Grandma instead of stealing from her. It means you should have protected her instead of enabling him. It means I shouldn't have to sacrifice my home and my security to fix problems I didn't create. Frank slammed his fist on the coffee table, making the teacups jump. This is all bullshit. Legal documents can be challenged. I'm calling my lawyer. You don't have a lawyer, Frank. You can't afford a lawyer. And even if you could, challenging the deed would require you to prove Grandma was mentally incompetent, which would mean admitting you let an incompetent person live alone and make financial decisions for years without intervening. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it as the implications sank in. The phone call. My phone rang, interrupting the tense silence. Vicky Chen's name appeared on the screen. "Excuse me," I said, stepping into the hallway to take the call. "Kate, I've been monitoring the police scanner like you asked. There was a disturbance call at your mother's address about 20 minutes ago. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. We're having a family discussion about Frank's living situation. And he's not taking it well?" Through the living room doorway, I could see Frank pacing again while Mom sat on the couch looking shell-shocked. "Not particularly. Do you need me to come over?" "I can be there in 15 minutes. I considered it. Having Vicky there would certainly end the argument quickly, but it would also escalate the situation beyond the point of family reconciliation. Despite everything, part of me still hoped we could resolve this without destroying what was left of our relationships. "Not yet. But stay available. Always. And Kate, remember what we discussed. You don't owe them your sanctuary. Some battles are worth fighting." Flashback a learning to fight. Vicky had been the one to teach me about boundaries. During those long conversations in her office as I'd processed my grandmother's death and my family's dysfunction. As a lawyer specializing in elder abuse, she'd seen too many families torn apart by financial predators who used emotional manipulation to avoid consequences. "The thing about people like Frank," she'd explained during one of our sessions, "is that they're only as powerful as the family members who enable them. They need someone to rescue them, someone to make excuses for them, someone to absorb the damage they cause. Take away the enablers, and they're just middle-aged men with addiction problems and poor impulse control." She'd helped me understand that my grandmother's decision to leave me the guest house wasn't just about property transfer. It was about breaking a generational pattern of women sacrificing themselves to protect men who had no intention of changing. "Your grandmother couldn't save herself," Vicky had said. "But she could save you. The question is, are you willing to be saved?" Present the ultimatum, I returned to the living room to find Frank rifling through the papers I'd left on the coffee table. Mom was watching him with that expression of anxious helplessness she wore whenever forced to witness his more obviously inappropriate behavior. "Put those down, Frank." He looked up, his eyes wild with desperation. "These bank statements, they don't prove anything. People loan money to family members all the time. Without documentation, without repayment plans. While the lender is recovering from a stroke and can barely sign her own name. She knew what she was doing. Then why did you forge her signature on the property sales?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Frank's face went through several expressions before settling on a carefully blank mask. "I don't know what you're talking about." I pulled out another set of documents, property records from the county assessor's office, showing 3 properties sold during Grandma Eleanor's hospitalization, all bearing signatures that forensic analysis had confirmed were forgeries. The Riverside property, the lake house, and the downtown apartment. All sold to shell companies owned by your former business partner, all while Grandma was physically incapable of holding a pen, let alone signing legal documents. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Frank, you didn't." "I was trying to help her." Frank's composure finally cracked completely. She needed money for medical bills. The properties were just sitting there, not generating income. I was trying to liquidate assets to pay for her care. Care that she wouldn't have needed if you hadn't stolen her health insurance premiums for 6 months, I replied. Care that she couldn't afford because you'd already drained her emergency fund. Care that you chose the cheapest possible facility for because you'd already spent her money on gambling debts. The room went dead silent except for Mom's quiet crying. The breaking point. Frank lunged at me then, his face twisted with rage and desperation. You sanctimonious bitch. You think you're so much better than everyone else, sitting in judgment, collecting your little papers and your little evidence. You destroyed this family. I stepped back calmly, my hand already reaching for my phone. Years of dealing with aggressive teenagers had taught me to de-escalate without showing fear. No, Frank. I documented what you did to this family. There's a difference. I'm going to contest that deed. I'm going to hire the best lawyer I can find and prove she wasn't competent. I'm going to get what's rightfully mine. With what money? Your construction job ended 2 months ago. Your unemployment benefits ran out last week. Your truck is going to be repossessed next month. You don't have money for groceries, let alone legal fees. Each fact hit him like a physical blow. It was cruel, perhaps, to strip away his illusions so methodically, but kindness had enabled his destruction of our family for too many years. Besides, I continued, challenging the deed would mean admitting that you knowingly exploited a mentally incompetent person for years. Federal prosecutors tend to take elder abuse seriously, especially when it involves forged documents and interstate wire fraud. Mom's choice. Stop, Mom said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been all afternoon. Both of you, just stop. She stood up slowly, wiping her eyes with a tissue, and for a moment I saw flashes of the woman she'd been before retirement, before Frank's problems had become her full-time occupation. Frank, you need to leave. Pat, you can't be serious. I'm your brother. I'm family. You're my brother who stole from our mother while she was dying. You're my brother who forged legal documents and committed fraud. You're my brother who has been lying to me for years about trying to get your life together. Frank's face cycled through shock, anger, and finally, a kind of desperate charm that had worked on her for decades. Pat, I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to change. I just need one more chance, one place to stay while I figure things out. You've had chances, Frank. Mother gave you chances for 20 years. I've given you chances. Catherine has given you chances. We're all out of chances. Mom walked to the front door and held it open. You need to leave now, and you need to find somewhere else to live. Frank's exit. Frank stared at her for a long moment, his face showing genuine bewilderment. Perhaps for the first time in his adult life, his charm and manipulation had failed to work on a family member. You're making a mistake, he said finally. All of you. Family is supposed to stick together. Family is supposed to take care of each other, I replied. Not exploit each other. He gathered his coat and walked to the door, pausing on the threshold. This isn't over, Catherine. You think you've won, but you don't know what you've started. I know exactly what I've started, Frank. I've started holding you accountable. After the door closed behind him, Mom and I stood in her living room, surrounded by the debris of 40 years of family dysfunction. I'm sorry, she said finally. I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected her. You were protecting what you thought was family, I replied. But Frank stopped being family the day he started stealing from a dying woman. 3 days later, the harassment begins. The anonymous call started at dawn. Heavy breathing, hang-ups, and finally, Frank's voice slurred with alcohol. You think you're smart, Katie, but you have no idea what's coming. I'd been expecting this. Vicky had warned me that men like Frank rarely accepted defeat gracefully, especially when their victims finally stood up to them. The text came next, from numbers I didn't recognize. Enjoy your stolen house while you can. Family always gets even. You'll regret crossing us. I forwarded each message to Vicky and to the police, building a harassment case as methodically as I'd built the property case. On the third day, I found my mailbox stuffed with printouts of social media posts that Jennifer had apparently been making, painting me as a heartless daughter who'd stolen family property and thrown her uncle into homelessness. Social media. Of course. Jennifer's generation solved every problem by taking it online and letting the court of public opinion render judgment. Jennifer's arrival. My younger sister arrived that afternoon in her Mercedes convertible, designer sunglasses perched on top of her perfectly styled hair. At 49, Jennifer had mastered the art of looking successful, expensive clothes, manicured nails, the kind of controlled appearance that impressed clients and intimidated opponents. "We need to talk," she announced, marching across my lawn in heels that immediately sank into the soft ground. "About your Instagram posts? I was wondering when you'd show up in person." Jennifer had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I was upset. Mom called me crying, said you'd thrown Uncle Frank out on the streets." Uncle Frank threw himself out on the streets when he decided to steal from a dying woman. That's not how Mom tells it. I pulled out my phone and showed her one of her own posts, a carefully curated photo of Frank looking pathetic beside his broken down truck, with a caption about family loyalty and elder abuse. Elder abuse is exactly what he committed, Jen. Against Grandma Eleanor. For years. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably, her high heels making small holes in my grass. "Look, I know Uncle Frank has had problems, but family is family. Can't you work something out?" I did work something out. I honored Grandma's wishes and protected her property from someone who would have sold it to pay gambling debts. But where is he supposed to live? The question hung between us, representing everything wrong with our family's approach to Frank's problems. Not, how can he learn to support himself, or what consequences might motivate him to change, but simply, where can we put him so he doesn't have to face the results of his choices? That's not my problem, Jen. It's his problem. He's a 68-year-old man who needs to figure out how to house and feed himself without stealing from family members. Flashback Jennifer's pattern. Jennifer had always been the family diplomat, the one who smoothed over conflicts and negotiated temporary truces that allowed everyone to avoid dealing with fundamental problems. When we were children, she'd been the one to convince me to share my birthday presents with Frank when he was going through a rough time. She'd been the one to suggest I loan him money for his second wedding when his finances were temporarily tight. Her diplomatic approach had worked well in her real estate career, where she specialized in helping divorcing couples divide property without destroying each other completely. But family dysfunction wasn't a property dispute. It was a pattern of abuse that required clear boundaries and permanent consequences. "You always were the practical one," she told me during Grandma's funeral, meaning it as a compliment. Thank God someone in this family knows how to handle the details. But handling details had meant enabling Frank's abuse by cleaning up his messes and protecting him from consequences. It had meant sacrificing my own needs to maintain family peace. It had meant learning to see my value only in terms of what I could provide for other people. Grandma Eleanor's gift of the guest house hadn't just been about property, it had been about teaching me that I deserved to have something that was mine alone. Something I didn't have to share or sacrifice for the greater good of family harmony. Present the sister conversation. "I'm not asking you to support him financially," Jennifer continued, pulling her phone out to show me more comments on her posts. "But maybe you could let him stay in the guest house for a few months while he gets back on his feet." "He's been getting back on his feet for 40 years, Jen. How many more months do you think he needs?" Jennifer's perfectly applied lipstick couldn't hide the way her mouth tightened with frustration. "You're being unreasonable. It's just temporary housing. Nothing with Frank is temporary. Remember when he was going to stay with Mom for just a few weeks after his second divorce? That turned into 3 years, and she's still paying his cell phone bill." I watched my sister process this information, seeing the moment when her carefully constructed narrative began to crack. Jennifer's success in real estate came from her ability to identify problems and create solutions. But she'd spent so many years avoiding our family's central problem that she'd lost the ability to see it clearly. "What do you want me to do, Kate? Delete the posts? Apologize publicly?" Her voice carried an edge of desperation that reminded me of Frank. I was trying to help. "Help who?" "Uncle Frank, who's threatened me 3 times this week. Mom, who's finally started setting boundaries with him. Or yourself, because having a homeless uncle doesn't fit your perfect family image." The accuracy of that last guess was written across Jennifer's face. Her social media presence was carefully curated to project success, happiness, and family values. Having to explain why her uncle was sleeping in his truck would complicate that narrative considerably. Jennifer's background to the cost of distance. Jennifer had worked hard to distance herself from our family's dysfunction. Her husband Marcus came from old money, the kind of established wealth that valued discretion and respectability above all else. Their children attended private schools, spent summers at the family compound in Martha's Vineyard, and had never been exposed to the chaos that defined the Morrison family dynamics. When Grandma Eleanor was dying, Jennifer had visited exactly twice, once when the initial diagnosis was made, and once for the funeral. She'd sent flowers regularly and had contributed money for medical expenses, but she'd maintained the careful distance that protected her own family from our family's toxic patterns. I didn't entirely blame her for that choice. Marriage and children changed your priorities, and Jennifer had built a good life for herself and her family. But her distance had also meant she'd never witnessed the full scope of Frank's manipulation and abuse. To her, he was still the charming uncle who'd taught her to ride a bike and had always remembered her birthday, not the financial predator who'd systematically destroyed our grandmother's security and dignity. Present, the confrontation deepened. "I'm not asking you to house him," Jennifer said, switching tactics. "But maybe you could help him find somewhere affordable? You must have connections from your teaching days. People who rent rooms or small apartments." "I'm not Frank's case manager, Jen. I'm not his parole officer or his rehabilitation counselor. I'm his niece, and I've already done more than enough by documenting his crimes and choosing not to press charges." "Crimes?" Jennifer's voice rose. "You're calling your own uncle a criminal?" I pulled out my phone and played a recording I'd made of one of Frank's threatening voicemails. His drunken voice filled the space between us. "You think you're so smart, Katie, but accidents happen. Houses burn down. People get hurt. Think about that while you're sleeping in your stolen bed." Jennifer's face went pale. "When did he leave that?" "Yesterday at 2 a.m. It's the third one this week. Would you like to hear the others?" She shook her head quickly, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I had no idea. He seemed so defeated when I saw him." "Defeated people don't usually make death threats, Jen. Desperate people do. Dangerous people do." The social media reckoning. Jennifer sat down heavily on my porch steps, her designer dress crinkling as she pulled out her phone. I watched her scroll through her own posts, seeing them now through the lens of what she'd just learned. "I need to delete these," she said quietly. "And I need to post a correction." "You need to stop trying to manage this situation entirely," I corrected. "This isn't a real estate deal that needs to be negotiated. This is a family member who's been committing crimes for years and is now facing consequences for the first time in his adult life. But what if he really hurts someone? What if he does something dangerous because he's desperate?" The question I'd been asking myself for 3 sleepless nights. Frank's escalating behavior suggested that he was moving beyond manipulation and into territory that genuinely concerned me. "That's why I filed for a restraining order," I said. "And why I've been documenting everything. If Frank makes the choice to escalate this situation, he'll face legal consequences that don't depend on family decisions or family loyalty." Jennifer looked up from her phone, and for the first time in years, I saw my little sister instead of the successful businesswoman she'd become. "I'm scared, Kate. What if we've pushed him too far?" "We didn't push him anywhere, Jen. We stopped enabling him. There's a difference." The police visit, as if summoned by our conversation, a patrol car pulled into my driveway. Officer Martinez, whom I'd spoken with when filing the restraining order, got out and approached us with the careful professionalism of someone delivering potentially bad news. "Ms. Morrison, we need to talk about Frank Morrison. He was arrested this morning for public intoxication and disturbing the peace outside your mother's house." Jennifer gasped, but I felt only a weary sense of inevitability. "Is my mother okay?" "She's fine. She's the one who called us. Said he was banging on her windows at 3 a.m., demanding to be let in. When we arrived, he was incoherent and aggressive. He's being held pending arraignment, but I wanted to warn you that he made some specific threats about you during processing." Officer Martinez consulted his notes. He said, and I quote, "Katie thinks she's safe in that house, but I know how to get in. I helped build those locks. and I can get past them. The blood drained from Jennifer's face. Oh my God. We take threats like this seriously, especially given the restraining order, Officer Martinez continued. I'd recommend staying somewhere else for a few days while we sort this out. Do you have somewhere safe to go? Decision point. I looked at my guest house, the small, peaceful sanctuary that had been my refuge for 10 years, the physical representation of my grandmother's love and protection. The thought of leaving it, even temporarily, felt like giving Frank exactly what he wanted. No, I said finally. I'm not leaving my home. Kate, be reasonable, Jennifer said, standing up and brushing off her dress. If he's dangerous, then running away won't solve the problem. It will just teach him that threats work. Officer Martinez nodded approvingly. We can increase patrols in this area, and I notice you have security cameras. That's good. But I appreciate your concern, Officer Martinez, but this is my home. My grandmother left it to me specifically so I would have a place where I felt safe and secure. I'm not going to let Frank's behavior drive me away from that. Jennifer's realization after Officer Martinez left, Jennifer and I sat in silence on my porch, both of us processing the reality that our family dysfunction had escalated to the point of police involvement. I owe you an apology, Jennifer said finally. I thought you were being cruel, forcing him out when he needed help. I didn't understand how bad things had gotten. You didn't want to understand, I replied, not unkindly. It was easier to believe that Frank was just unlucky, that he needed compassion instead of consequences. It was easier to blame me for being heartless than to acknowledge that someone in our family is genuinely dangerous. Jennifer pulled out her phone and began deleting her social media posts, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. What can I do to help? I mean, really help, not just try to manage the situation. The question surprised me. Jennifer had spent so many years avoiding family problems that I'd stopped expecting her to engage with them constructively. Help Mom understand that this isn't her fault, I said. Help her see that she did the right thing by calling the police instead of letting him intimidate her into opening her door. What about Frank? What happens to him now? That depends on Frank. If he accepts responsibility for his behavior and gets serious help for his addiction and his anger issues, maybe there's hope for him. If he continues to blame everyone else and make threats, then he'll keep facing consequences until he learns or until he ends up in prison. Mom's call. My phone rang as Jennifer was finishing the deletion of her posts. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and I could hear the anxiety in her voice before she even spoke. Catherine, I'm so sorry. I should have called you first, but he was so angry, and I was frightened, Mom. You did exactly the right thing. You called the police when someone was threatening you. That's what you're supposed to do. But he's my brother. He's family. The word that had been used to justify so much damage over the years. He's also someone who made threats against you and me. Being family doesn't give him the right to terrorize people. Jennifer took the phone from me. Mom, it's Jen. Kate's right. Uncle Frank needs professional help, not family accommodation. We've been enabling him for too long. I listened to my sister talk to her mother, hearing a maturity and clarity in her voice that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Sometimes crisis had the power to cut through years of denial and self-deception, forcing people to see situations as they actually were instead of as they wished them to be. That night, I sat in my living room with all the lights on, my phone within reach, and Vicky's number on speed dial. The security cameras showed my property from multiple angles, and I'd installed motion-activated lights around the perimeter after Frank's first threatening call. Around midnight, I heard a car drive slowly down my street, engine rumbling like Frank's old truck. The motion lights didn't activate, suggesting the vehicle stayed on the road, but I watched the security monitors until the sound faded into the distance. I thought about the 10 years I'd spent in this house, the sanctuary it had provided during my divorce, the place where I'd learned to live alone without being lonely. I thought about Grandma Eleanor's garden, which I'd maintained and expanded, adding new varieties of roses and perennials that bloomed throughout the growing season. Most of all, I thought about the choice my grandmother had given me, and not just the house itself, but the opportunity to break a generational pattern of women sacrificing themselves to protect men who had no intention of changing. Morning, the resolution begins. I woke to the sound of someone knocking on my door, not the aggressive banging that Frank favored, but a polite, measured rhythm. Through the security monitor, I saw Vicky standing on my porch with a briefcase and two coffee cups. Thought you might need caffeine and legal updates, she said when I opened the door. Both would be appreciated. We sat at my kitchen table while Vicky spread out documents related to Frank's arrest and the restraining order violation. The good news is that his behavior last night strengthens your case considerably. Threatening you while already under a restraining order is a felony, and the recorded threats give us enough evidence to pursue criminal charges if necessary. What's the bad news? The bad news is that Frank's appointed attorney is going to argue that he's having a mental health crisis related to grief over losing family support. They'll try to get him into a treatment program instead of jail time. I sipped my coffee, considering this. Would that be a bad thing? If he actually got treatment, depends on whether he's committed to change or just committed to avoiding consequences. Court-ordered treatment can be effective, but only if the person genuinely wants help. Frank's choice. The call came that afternoon from Frank's court-appointed attorney, a weary-sounding woman named Sarah Collins who specialized in representing people who couldn't afford private counsel. Ms. Morrison, I'm calling about your uncle's case. He's asked me to reach out to see if there's any possibility of family mediation instead of pursuing criminal charges. What kind of mediation? A structured conversation with a professional mediator where family members can express their concerns and work together to develop a plan for moving forward. It's voluntary for all parties, but it might help resolve this situation without anyone going to prison. I found myself considering it, despite everything. Not because I felt sorry for Frank, but because I recognized that his choices were affecting our entire family, and maybe a mediated conversation could help everyone understand the scope of the damage and the requirements for repair. What would be required of Frank? Full accountability for his past behavior, agreement to undergo addiction treatment and anger management counseling, and strict adherence to the restraining order while those services are ongoing. And if he violates any of those conditions, then the criminal charges proceed, and he faces the full legal consequences of his behavior. Family meeting the mediation. The mediation session was held in the conference room of Vicky's law firm, neutral territory that didn't belong to any of us. Frank sat across from me, looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen him. 3 days in jail had stripped away his usual bluster, leaving behind a 68-year-old man facing the possibility of spending his remaining years in prison. Mom sat beside me, with Jennifer on her other side. The mediator, Dr. Rebecca Stevens, was a woman in her 60s who specialized in family conflict resolution and had seen enough dysfunction to remain calm in the face of our particular brand of chaos. Frank, would you like to start by acknowledging what happened? Dr. Stevens asked. Frank's hands shook slightly as he spoke. I've been drinking too much since my last divorce, and I've been angry about losing my place in this family. I made threats that I shouldn't have made, and I scared people I care about. It was a start, but it felt rehearsed, like something his attorney had coached him to say. Can you be more specific about the threats? Dr. Stevens pressed. Frank's face flushed, but he continued. I called Catherine and left messages saying that accidents could happen to her house, that she wasn't safe. I went to Pat's house in the middle of the night and tried to force her to let me in. I said things about getting into Catherine's house that made her afraid. And before these recent incidents, can you acknowledge the other behaviors that led to the situation? This was where the real test would come. Frank had spent decades deflecting responsibility for his actions, blaming circumstances, bad luck, other people's unreasonable expectations. Whether he could actually acknowledge the scope of his behavior would determine whether mediation was possible. I took money from my mother without asking. I sold some of her things when she was in the hospital. I signed documents using her name when she couldn't write anymore. Frank's voice got quieter with each admission. I told myself I was helping her, but I was really helping myself. Mom gasped softly. Even though she'd heard some of this before, hearing Frank admitted directly seemed to affect her more powerfully than any evidence I could have presented. The accountability moment. Frank, Dr. Stevens continued. How do you think your behavior affected your family members? I scared them. I hurt them financially. I made them feel like they couldn't trust me. He looked directly at me for the first time since the mediation began. I made Catherine feel like she had to protect herself from her own family. And how do you think your mother, Olivia, was affected by your behavior in her final years? This was the question that would determine whether Frank was genuinely ready to change or simply going through the motions to avoid prison. Frank was quiet for a long time, his hands clenched in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I made her last years about my problems instead of her needs. I made her afraid of being alone with me because she never knew what I might take. I made her feel like she had to hide her own possessions from her own son. Tears started rolling down his cheeks. I made a dying woman feel unsafe in her own home. The room was silent except for Mom's quiet crying. Even Jennifer, who'd maintained her composure throughout most of our family crisis, was wiping her eyes. I can't undo what I did, Frank continued. But I can stop making it worse. I can get help from my drinking and my gambling. I can find somewhere to live that doesn't depend on family guilt or manipulation. I can learn to be the kind of person she wanted me to be instead of the person I became. The agreement, Dr. Stevens helped us draft an agreement that felt both compassionate and protective. Frank would enter a residential treatment program for his addictions, followed by transitional housing with continued outpatient support. He would have no contact with any family members for the first 6 months of treatment, giving everyone time to heal and adjust. After that initial period, supervised contact could resume if Frank was meeting all the requirements of his treatment plan and if family members felt ready to engage with him. Any violation of the restraining order or any threatening behavior would result in immediate termination of the agreement and full prosecution of the criminal charges. This isn't a guarantee, Dr. Stevens explained to all of us. Frank's recovery is ultimately his responsibility, but it's an opportunity for him to demonstrate that he's committed to change, and it's an opportunity for the family to see whether reconciliation is possible. Frank signed the agreement with shaking hands. Thank you, he said to all of us. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm going to try to earn it. 6 months later, the garden. Spring had come early that year, and Grandma Eleanor's roses were blooming more abundantly than I'd ever seen them. I was pruning the climbing rose that covered the east side of the guest house when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Mom walked across the lawn slowly, carrying a small box and wearing the kind of tentative expression that meant she had something difficult to discuss. How's the garden coming along? She asked, settling onto the bench that faced the rose beds. Good. I added some new varieties this year, ones that bloom later in the season, so there's color through the fall. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching bees work their way through the flowers. Our relationship had improved significantly over the past 6 months, as Mom had gradually accepted that protecting Frank from consequences hadn't actually been helping him. I got a letter from Frank, she said finally, opening the box she'd brought. From the treatment center. He wanted me to give this to you. Inside the box was a small wooden carving of a rose, clearly handmade and carefully sanded smooth. The attached note was written in Frank's familiar handwriting, but the tone was different from anything I'd ever received from him. Catherine, I made this in woodworking class. It's not much, but I wanted you to have something beautiful instead of something taken. I know I have years of work ahead to become the uncle you deserved. Thank you for giving me the chance to try. Frank, the choice. I held the wooden rose, feeling its weight and the care that had gone into its creation. 6 months ago, I would have seen it as another manipulation, another attempt to avoid consequences through charm and gesture. But something about its simplicity and the letter's tone made me think that maybe, possibly, Frank was beginning to understand the difference between performance and genuine change. What do you think? Mom asked. The treatment center says he's making good progress, but they also said the real test comes when he transitions back to independent living. I set the wooden rose on the bench between us, where it caught the afternoon sunlight. I think time will tell, but I'm glad he's trying. Are you willing to see him when his no-contact period ends? The question I'd been avoiding for months. Frank's recovery wasn't just about his willingness to change, it was also about my willingness to believe that change was possible, to risk being hurt again for the possibility of having a real relationship with my uncle. Maybe, I said finally, in a structured setting with clear boundaries. If he continues to make progress. Mom nodded, understanding that this was as much as I could offer right now. That seems fair, Jennifer's visit. That evening, Jennifer and her family stopped by for dinner, something that had become a monthly tradition since our family crisis had forced us all to reevaluate our relationships. Her teenagers, Emma and Jake, were helping me plant new bulbs along the front walkway while Jennifer and Marcus prepared dinner in the guest house kitchen. Aunt Kate, Emma said, carefully placing tulip bulbs in the holes we dug. Mom says Uncle Frank might come back to visit sometime. Maybe, I replied, if he continues getting better. Are you scared? Jake asked with the directness that only 17-year-olds could manage. I considered the question seriously. Not scared exactly, but cautious. Sometimes people change, and sometimes they just get better at hiding their problems. It takes time to tell the difference. Emma looked up from her planting. Grandma Nana always said her roses came back stronger after being cut back. Maybe people can too. The wisdom of teenagers, filtered through the memory of a great-grandmother who'd understood the necessity of pruning for growth. 1 year later, the test, Frank's request for a supervised visit came on the anniversary of Grandma Eleanor's death. He'd completed residential treatment, had been living in transitional housing for 4 months, and had maintained steady employment at a furniture restoration workshop. The meeting was arranged at Dr. Stevens' office, with both Vicky and Frank's counselor present. When I walked into the conference room, I barely recognized the man sitting at the table. Frank had gained weight, healthy weight that filled out his previously gaunt frame. His clothes were clean and well-fitted, his hair was properly cut, and his eyes were clear in a way I hadn't seen in decades. But most importantly, his posture was different. Instead of the aggressive energy or desperate charm that had defined his interactions with family, he sat quietly, hands folded, waiting for permission to speak. Catherine, he said when Dr. Stevens indicated that he could begin. Thank you for agreeing to see me. How are you doing, Frank? Better. Not perfect, not cured, but better. I've been sober for 10 months. I go to A meetings every day, and I have a sponsor who doesn't let me get away with bullshit. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've learned that I spent most of my adult life blaming other people for problems I created, and using family guilt to avoid consequences. I hurt everyone who tried to help me, especially you and Mom. The Frank I remembered would have used this opportunity to ask for something of money, housing, forgiveness, absolution. This Frank seemed content to simply acknowledge what had happened without requesting anything in return. What are your plans for the future? I asked. Continue treatment. Keep my job. They've offered me full-time employment if I complete my probationary period. Save money so I can afford my own apartment instead of depending on subsidized housing. He looked directly at me. Learn to be someone my family can trust, even if that takes years. The letter, before I left that day, Frank handed me an envelope. I wrote letters to everyone, you, Mom, Jennifer, even Grandma Eleanor's grave. My counselor said it was important to acknowledge the specific harm I caused to each person. I read the letter that night, sitting in my living room with Grandma Eleanor's photo on the table beside me. It was 5 pages long, handwritten, and detailed in its acknowledgement of specific incidents spanning 20 years. Frank had remembered things I'd forgotten, had connected patterns of behavior I'd never fully recognized, and had taken responsibility for damage I'd tried to minimize in my own mind. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. It simply stated facts, accepted responsibility, and expressed genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused. It ended with a sentence that surprised me with its maturity. I understand that trust is earned through consistent actions over time, and I'm prepared to spend however long it takes to prove that I've changed. Decision point. 2 weeks later, I called Frank's counselor to discuss the possibility of occasional supervised visits. Not because I was ready to trust him completely, but because I wanted to see whether his apparent transformation would hold up over time. What would make you feel safe about increasing contact? The counselor asked. Consistency, I replied. I need to see that his behavior remains stable when he's stressed, when things don't go his way, when he faces disappointments or setbacks. That's very wise. Recovery isn't just about avoiding substances, it's about learning new ways to handle life's challenges. We arranged monthly visits for the next 6 months, always in supervised settings, always with clear boundaries. Frank never pushed for more contact, never tried to manipulate the situation to his advantage. never made the visits about his needs instead of the family's comfort level. The breakthrough. The breakthrough came during our fourth supervised visit when Frank mentioned that he'd been offered a promotion at work but had turned it down. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. Because it would mean working weekends, and I didn't want to miss my AA meetings or my counseling sessions. I learned that I have to prioritize my recovery over financial opportunities, at least for now. The old Frank would have taken the promotion and found ways to rationalize skipping treatment. The old Frank would have seen the extra money as solving his problems, regardless of the risks to his sobriety. That must have been a difficult decision, I said. A year ago, it would have been impossible. But I've learned that short-term sacrifices can prevent long-term disasters. Besides, he smiled slightly. I'm making enough to pay my rent and buy groceries. That's more financial stability than I've had in 20 years. The garden invitation, 6 months after our first supervised visit. I did something that surprised even me. I invited Frank to help me with Grandma Eleanor's roses. I could use help with the heavy pruning, I explained to Mom over the phone. And I want to see how he handles being in the space where she used to spend so much time. Mom was quiet for a moment. Are you sure you're ready for that? I'm not sure about anything, I admitted. But I think it's time to find out. Frank arrived on a Saturday morning carrying his own pruning shears and wearing clothes he clearly didn't mind getting dirty. We worked in silence for the first hour, cutting back the climbing roses that had grown wild over the winter. She loved these roses, Frank said finally, his voice soft with memory. She used to say they reminded her that beautiful things could grow even in difficult conditions. Do you remember helping her plant them? Frank stopped pruning and looked at me with surprise. You know about that, she told me, toward the end. She said you were about 12, and you spent a whole weekend digging holes and carrying water buckets. I'd forgotten. Frank's eyes filled with tears. I'd forgotten all the good things, all the ways she tried to include me and teach me. I only remembered the times she said no to things I wanted. We continued working, and slowly, Frank began sharing other memories, times when Grandma Eleanor had helped him with school projects, had attended his high school football games even when his own parents were too busy, had continued to believe in his potential long after he'd stopped believing in it himself. I think she kept hoping I'd remember who I used to be, he said, before the drinking and the gambling and the anger took over. Maybe that's why she left me the house, I replied. Not to punish you, but to preserve something good until you were ready to appreciate it again. The conversation, that afternoon, as we cleaned up the pruning debris, Frank asked the question I'd been expecting for months. Catherine, do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? I set down my garden gloves and considered how to answer honestly. I think forgiveness is a process, not a moment. I can see that you've changed, and I'm grateful for that. But trust takes time to rebuild. I understand. And I want you to know that I'm not doing this recovery work to get back into the family. I'm doing it because I finally understand how much damage I caused and how much pain I've been carrying around. Frank sat down on the garden bench, looking older than his 69 years, but also more peaceful than I'd ever seen him. My sponsor says that making amends isn't about getting forgiveness, it's about taking responsibility and changing behavior. Whether you ever fully trust me again is up to you, and I respect whatever you decide. Mom's healing had been slower, but no less significant than Frank's. The early signs of dementia that had made her vulnerable to his manipulation had stabilized with proper medical care and reduced stress. More importantly, she'd started attending a support group for families affected by addiction, where she was learning to distinguish between helping and enabling. I spent so many years making excuses for Frank that I forgot how to hold him accountable, she told me during one of our weekly tea visits. I thought love meant never letting someone face consequences, but really, I was just protecting myself from having to acknowledge how bad things had gotten. She'd also begun exploring her own interests again, joining a book club, volunteering at the library, taking art classes at the community center. For the first time in decades, Mom's life wasn't organized around managing Frank's crises. Do you think he's really changed? She asked during one of our conversations. I think he's learned to manage his problems differently, I replied. Whether that's permanent change or just better coping skills remains to be seen. Either way, it's an improvement. The anniversary, 2 years after Frank entered treatment, we held a memorial service for Grandma Eleanor in the garden. It wasn't a sad occasion, more of a celebration of her life and the peace that had finally come to our family. Frank had been out of treatment for over a year by then, living independently and maintaining steady employment. His relationship with all of us remained careful and structured, but it was also genuine in a way that hadn't existed for decades. "I want to say something," Frank announced as we gathered around the rose garden after the brief service. "Grandma Eleanor tried to teach me about consequences and responsibility my whole life, but I was too selfish and too scared to listen. It took losing everything, my marriages, my jobs, my relationships with all of you before I was desperate enough to actually hear what she'd been trying to tell me." He paused, looking at each of us in turn. "I know I can't give back the years I stole from her or undo the pain I caused this family. But I can promise that the rest of my life will be different. Not perfect, but honest. Not without mistakes, but with accountability." The resolution, as the afternoon sun slanted across the garden, casting long shadows through the rose bushes, I found myself thinking about cycles of growth and renewal. Grandma Eleanor's roses bloomed each year more abundantly than the last, strengthened by careful pruning and sustained by deep roots. Our family had needed pruning too, the removal of toxic patterns, the establishment of healthy boundaries, the patient work of rebuilding trust. Like the roses, we were stronger for having survived the cutting back, more beautiful for having learned to grow in healthier ways. Frank was watering the newest plantings, moving carefully among the thorny branches with the patience of someone who'd learned to value fragile things. Mom was deadheading spent blooms, humming softly to herself in a way I hadn't heard since childhood. Jennifer was taking photos of her children as they explored the garden, creating new memories to replace the painful ones. And I was standing in the space my grandmother had created, surrounded by the family she'd loved enough to save, and not through enabling or excuse making, but through the harder gift of accountability and truth. Epilogue: 3 years later, the guest house has become exactly what Grandma Eleanor intended: a sanctuary where healing happens slowly, where love is expressed through boundaries as much as through acceptance, where the past informs the present without controlling the future. Frank visits once a month now, always by invitation, always respecting the limits that keep everyone safe. He's been promoted to shop supervisor at the furniture restoration business and has started dating a woman from his AA group who understands the work of recovery. Mom has settled into a routine that includes both independence and family connection. Her memory issues have stabilized, and she's found purpose in mentoring other families dealing with addiction through the support groups she attends. Jennifer and I have rebuilt our sisterhood on a foundation of honesty rather than diplomacy. Her children know the full story of their family's struggles and recovery, lessons that will serve them well if they ever face similar challenges. As for me, I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is to refuse to enable their destruction. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, and that trust can be rebuilt through consistent actions over time. The roses bloom more beautifully each year, hardy perennials that survive winter and return each spring stronger than before. They remind me daily that some things are worth fighting for, worth protecting, and worth the patient work of tending. In the end, Grandma Eleanor's greatest gift wasn't the house itself, it was the lesson that love sometimes requires the courage to say no, to set boundaries, to choose healing over harmony. She taught me that I deserved a sanctuary, and she gave me the tools to protect it. The guest house stands as a testament to that lesson, a place where damaged people can learn to be whole, where broken relationships can be carefully mended, where the cycle of dysfunction can finally be broken by those brave enough to choose something better. Some battles are worth fighting. Some boundaries are worth defending. Some sanctuaries are worth preserving, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that come after us who deserve to inherit healing rather than harm. The roses know this truth instinctively, blooming year after year despite the thorns that protect them, beautiful and strong and endlessly renewable. Like love itself, when it's finally allowed to grow in healthy soil. I want a divorce. The words hung in the air of our living room like a death sentence. Robert's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor I'd spent years keeping pristine. The sound echoed through our house, the same house where I'd swallowed my pride for 22 years of marriage, where I'd smiled politely through countless dinner parties while his mother Patricia treated me like hired help. "Margaret, you can't be serious," Robert stammered, his face pale as the morning light streaming through our bay windows. This is about the money, isn't it? About Florida? I stared at the newspaper spread across our coffee table. The headline read, Local Teachers Ed Tech Company Acquired for $20 Million. My photograph smiled back at me from the business section, not the meek, accommodating wife Robert thought he knew, but the CEO of Eduvision Technologies, the company I'd built from our garage while he slept peacefully upstairs, never questioning my late-night grading sessions. It's about respect, I said quietly, the same voice I'd used to calm anxious students for 2 decades. Something you've never shown me. Robert's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Behind him, I could see the framed photographs lining our mantel, 22 years of family gatherings where his mother Patricia dominated every conversation, every decision, every moment. 22 years of me standing slightly behind, slightly to the side, smiling that practice smile I'd perfected to keep the peace. But you're a teacher, he said, as if that simple statement could somehow erase the newspaper article, could make my success disappear. You grade papers. You make bulletin boards. I almost laughed at the reduction of my professional life to such trivial tasks. Yes, I graded papers. Yes, I created engaging displays for my classroom. But I also held a master's degree in educational technology, had published peer-reviewed articles on adaptive learning systems, and had spent the last 15 years revolutionizing how children with learning differences access education. I am a teacher, I confirmed, standing and walking to the window that overlooked our carefully manicured backyard. I am also a CEO, an entrepreneur, and until this morning, your wife. Though that last part is currently under review. Flashback 3 months earlier. The family dinner, I had been sitting at Patricia's mahogany dining table, the one she'd inherited from her grandmother and never let anyone forget it. The table where I'd endured monthly family dinners for 22 years, listening to her whole court on everything from politics to parenting to my charming little teaching hobby. The irony wasn't lost on me that evening, as I watched Patricia wave her diamond-studded hands while discussing my career prospects. Those diamonds she was so proud of probably cost less than what my adaptive learning platform generated in daily revenue, but she had no way of knowing that. None of them did. Really, Margaret dear, Patricia had said, dabbing her mouth with an embroidered napkin that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. I don't understand why you insist on working those measly hours at that public school when Robert makes enough to support you both. The words stung as they always did. Measly hours. As if the passion I poured into my classroom, the innovative teaching methods I developed, the lives I'd touched over 2 decades meant nothing because they didn't generate visible wealth. I caught Robert's eye across the table, searching for any sign that he might defend me, might stand up to his mother even once. Instead, he looked down at his plate like a scolded child, the same expression he'd worn since childhood whenever his mother criticized someone in his presence. 22 years, I'd thought, taking a sip of wine to wash down the bitterness that had nothing to do with the vintage. 22 years of this. I enjoy teaching, I'd replied simply, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. What I hadn't mentioned was the educational technology platform I'd built from scratch in our garage, starting with a simple observation. Children learn differently, and our one-size-fits-all educational system was failing millions of them. Well, Patricia had continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We've been planning this wonderful family vacation to our condo in Naples. 3 weeks at the beachfront property. William's already made all the arrangements, haven't you, dear? William, Robert's father, had barely looked up from his phone. At 78, he perfected the art of selective hearing when it came to his wife's pronouncements. All set for next month. Robert will handle your portion of the expenses, of course, Patricia had added, shooting me a look that clearly suggested I couldn't possibly contribute to such an endeavor. How much are we talking about? I'd asked, genuinely curious. Oh, just $45,000 for both couples. Patricia had waved her hand dismissively. A bargain, really, for 3 weeks in paradise. Robert already agreed it wouldn't be a problem. I'd nearly choked on my wine. Not because of the amount, $45,000 represented less than a week of my company's revenue, but because of the casual assumption that Robert would make such a significant financial decision without consulting me. Robert, I'd said, turning to my husband and keeping my voice carefully neutral. When did you agree to this? Robert had tugged at his collar, a nervous habit I'd recognized since our dating days. Mom mentioned it last week. I thought, well, we could make it work. Make it work. As if our financial situation was precarious. As if we were scraping by on my teacher's salary and his modest law firm income. If only they knew about the separate account where I'd been quietly building our real future. Make it work. Patricia had laughed. Don't be modest, Robert. You're doing wonderfully at the firm, and it's not like Margaret's teacher's salary would have contributed much anyway. The words had hit me like a physical blow. Robert had said nothing to correct her assumptions, had allowed his mother to diminish my contributions to our household. Susan, Robert's sister, had spoken up for the first time that evening. Mom, that's a bit harsh. It's just the truth, Patricia had insisted. Someone needs to say it. Margaret could be doing so much more with her life instead of playing teacher part-time. I'd felt a smile tugging at my lips despite my anger, imagining Patricia's reaction if she knew about the acquisition offer sitting in my email inbox or the interview request from the local business journal. You're right, Patricia, I'd said softly, watching surprise flash across her face. Someone does need to say the truth. The truth is, I continued, standing, I need to excuse myself. I have some lesson plans to prepare for tomorrow. As I'd walked toward the door, I'd caught Patricia's triumphant smirk. She thought she'd won, thought she'd finally succeeded in putting me in my place. Let her believe what she wanted. The truth would come eventually, and when it did, it would be devastating. Flashback of the seeds of success. Walking to my car that night, I'd allowed myself to remember how it all started. The idea that would eventually become EduVision Technologies had come to me during my third year of teaching, in a moment of frustration that would change everything. I'd been working with a student named Tommy Martinez, a brilliant 8-year-old who struggled with traditional math curricula. He could grasp complex concepts intuitively but couldn't show his work in the step-by-step manner the textbooks required. Mrs. Thompson, he'd said one afternoon, tears of frustration in his eyes. I know the answer is 12, but I can't show you how I know. It's just there in my head. That night, I'd stayed up until 2 a.m. researching adaptive learning algorithms on my ancient laptop. I discovered papers on artificial intelligence in education, studies on personalized learning pathways, research on how children with different cognitive styles could thrive with customized instruction. There has to be a better way, I'd thought. There has to be a system that meets children where they are, not where we think they should be. That was 15 years ago. 15 years of staying up late after Robert fell asleep, learning programming languages and user interface design. 15 years of attending educational technology conferences during school breaks, telling Robert they were teacher training sessions while I networked with venture capitalists and fellow entrepreneurs. The first prototype had been embarrassingly simple, a basic program that adjusted math problem difficulty based on student responses. I'd tested it secretly with Tommy and 3 other struggling students, telling their parents it was experimental tutoring software I was evaluating for the district. The results had been remarkable. Within 6 weeks, all 4 students had improved their math performance by at least 2 grade levels. Tommy had gone from failing to testing as mathematically gifted. Your mother-in-law doesn't need to know about every aspect of your life, Jennifer Mills had warned me when I'd first approached her about becoming my business partner. We'd met at an educational technology conference in Chicago where she'd been presenting research on AI-driven learning systems. Jennifer was everything I wasn't in the business world: confident, experienced in startup culture, comfortable with venture capitalists. She was also a former teacher, which meant she understood both the educational mission and the market potential. Some people would try to claim ownership of your success if they knew about it, she continued. Especially family members who've never supported your ambitions. Keep this separate until you're strong enough to protect it. How right she'd been. Over the years, as EduVision grew from a garage startup to a multi-million-dollar company, I'd watched other entrepreneurs whose families had tried to claim credit, demand equity, or interfere with business decisions. By keeping my business life completely separate, I'd protected not just my company, but my sanity. Robert knew I sometimes worked late on school projects. He knew I occasionally traveled to teacher conferences, but he'd never asked deeper questions, never shown curiosity about the specifics of my work. His lack of curiosity had hurt initially, but eventually it had become protective. If he'd known about the company's growth, would he have supported my vision or would he have tried to manage it? Would he have been proud of my accomplishments or would he have worried about how his mother would react? I'd never had to find out because I'd never given him the chance to disappoint me. The phone call that changed everything. 3 days after that disastrous family dinner, I'd been grading papers at my favorite coffee shop downtown when my phone had buzzed with a notification that made my hands tremble. My banking app alert read, "Withdrawal $45,000. Transaction approved." For a moment, I'd stared at the screen in disbelief. Robert had actually done it. He'd actually emptied our joint savings account to pay for his mother's vacation without discussing it with me first. I'd immediately called Robert. "Hey, honey," he'd answered, his voice artificially cheerful. "I was just about to call you." "Were you?" I'd cut him off. "Before or after you emptied our joint account?" The silence had stretched long enough for my heart to break a little more at my husband's inability to simply tell the truth. "Mom said it would be better to handle it quickly," he'd finally mumbled. "You know, to secure the reservations." "Just stop, Robert. You didn't even discuss this with me. You made a $45,000 decision unilaterally." "Well, you were on board at dinner the other night." On board. As if being polite to his mother constituted financial consent. Being polite to your mother is not the same as agreeing to spend our savings on her vacation fantasy, I'd said, watching Jennifer enter the coffee shop right on time for our weekly business meeting. Her smile had faded when she'd seen my expression. "We'll discuss this later," I told Robert, hanging up before he could offer more excuses. Jennifer had slid into the chair across from me, immediately going to my phone screen where the withdrawal notification was still visible. "Spill it," she demanded. "What did that spineless husband of yours do now?" I'd shown her the notification without speaking. "He didn't." "He did." I'd accepted the fresh coffee she'd ordered for me. "And you know what the worst part is? He just assumed I'd go along with it like I always do." "Like you always have," Jennifer had corrected gently. "You've been protecting him from the truth for years, letting him and his family believe you're this passive, struggling teacher. It protected the business," I defended weakly. "Maybe it's time to consider whether the protection is worth the cost," Jennifer had said softly. My phone had buzzed again, this time with a message from David Chen, my tech director. "Major tech blog wants to feature our adaptive algorithm. Time sensitive." "The universe has interesting timing," I'd murmured, showing Jennifer the message. "You know what would be poetic justice?" Jennifer had said, her eyes sparkling. "Let them take their fancy vacation. Let them spend what they think is your life savings. Meanwhile, we accept that business journal interview request we've been putting off." I'd felt something shift inside me as she spoke, a door opening that I'd kept carefully locked for 15 years. "If we're going to do this, we might as well do it properly," I'd said, my mind already racing through possibilities. Flashback my mother's wisdom. That night, alone in our house while Robert presumably celebrated his successful financial manipulation with his parents, I'd found myself thinking about my mother. She died when I was 30, just 2 years into my marriage, but her voice still echoed in my head during moments of crisis. "Margaret," she'd said during one of our last conversations, "never let anyone make you feel small for being smart. Some people will try to diminish you because your success threatens their sense of control." She'd been talking about my first principal, who tried to discourage me from pursuing my master's degree. But her words applied perfectly to Patricia's constant undermining, to Robert's passive acceptance of his mother's treatment of me. My mother had grown up during the Great Depression, understood the value of financial independence, the importance of having your own identity separate from your husband's achievements. "Keep your own dreams, your own goals, your own bank account," she told me shortly after I'd gotten engaged. "A woman who can take care of herself can choose to be in a marriage rather than needing to be." I thought I was following her advice by continuing to teach, by maintaining my professional identity. What I hadn't realized was that I'd been hiding the most important parts of myself. My mother would have been proud of what I'd built with Eduvision. She'd have understood the quiet satisfaction of proving wrong everyone who'd underestimated the nice teacher lady. But she also would have questioned why I'd hidden my success for so long. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, she'd often said. You can control when and how, or you can let circumstances decide for you. The vacation begins observing from afar while Robert and his parents lived it up in their Naples beachfront condo, posting Instagram photos of champagne toasts and sunset dinners. I'd thrown myself into the most important business negotiations of my career. The acquisition offer from EduCorp had been on the table for 6 months. $20 million upfront, plus a consulting contract that would let me guide the integration of my platform into their broader educational ecosystem. It meant my adaptive learning system would reach millions of students nationwide. Are you sure you want to finalize this now? Jennifer had asked as we'd reviewed the contracts. While they're away, the timing is perfect, I'd replied, signing page after page. Let them enjoy their vacation. They have no idea what's waiting for them when they get back. The local business journal interview had been scheduled for the following week. Rather than seeking national attention, I decided to start with our community. The angle was perfect. Local teacher revolutionizes adaptive learning technology while staying true to classroom roots. We want to focus on the education aspect, Maria Santos, the journalist, had explained. How your classroom experience informed your business decisions. It's an inspiring story of staying true to your values while achieving success. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same teaching career that Patricia dismissed as worthless was actually the foundation of my business empire. Every algorithm I developed had been informed by real classroom observations. I never stopped being a teacher, I told Maria during our interview, sitting in my classroom surrounded by student artwork. The technology was just a way to extend my reach. The revelation builds social media torture. During the 3 weeks of their vacation, I'd watched Robert's social media posts with growing determination. His Instagram stories were a chronicle of luxury, champagne at sunset, 5-course dinners, chartered boat trips. Patricia featured prominently in the photos, posed against backdrops of crystal clear water. Her captions were masterpieces of subtle condescension. Some people work for luxury, others were born for it. #blessed #Naples life. Another post showed her lounging by their private pool. Grateful for family that knows how to treat each other right. #spoilage worth it. The most galling was a photo of Robert raising a champagne flute. To family that supports your dreams. #grateful #blessed #family first family that supports your dreams. I'd stared at that caption for a long time, wondering if Robert truly believed that that's what had happened. Each post had been accompanied by dozens of likes and comments from friends who knew me personally. Living the good life. You deserve it. The responses had felt like tiny cuts, each one a reminder of how invisible I'd become in my own marriage. But the worst had been a video Patricia had posted from their upgraded suite. Robert had surprised his parents with an even more expensive accommodation. The video showed their private balcony view with Patricia's voice narrating. My wonderful son surprised us with this incredible upgrade. He's so generous. We raised him right. We raised him right. As if I had nothing to do with the man Robert had become. As if our 22-year marriage was irrelevant. I'd screenshotted that post as evidence. Evidence of how thoroughly my contributions were ignored, how completely my existence was dismissed. By the end of their vacation, Robert had spent nearly $60,000 of what he believed was our life savings, all while his mother praised him on social media for his financial wisdom. The interview process claiming my voice. The Business Journal interview had gone better than I'd hoped. Maria Santos had researched not just Eduvision's financial success, but its educational impact. She'd spoken with school administrators, teachers, even parents whose children had benefited from my platform. What strikes me most, Maria had said as we'd wrapped up our conversation, is how you've managed to build this successful company while maintaining your core identity as an educator. I never wanted to leave teaching, I'd replied honestly. The classroom is where I learned everything that made Eduvision possible. Every algorithm we develop is tested against real student interactions. The photographer's session had been equally thoughtful. Rather than corporate headshots, he'd captured me in my natural environment, working with students, reviewing code during lunch break, explaining concepts using the same whiteboard where I taught fractions to third graders. These images tell a story, he said. They show that success doesn't have to mean abandoning your values. You're still unmistakably a teacher, just one who happened to revolutionize educational technology. The tech blog interview had been more technical, focusing on the AI aspects of our platform. That piece would reach industry professionals, while the business journal would reach our community, including Robert's family. The timing couldn't be better, Jennifer had said, reviewing the publication's schedule. The tech piece goes live Monday morning. The business journal hits stands Tuesday. They'll be back Tuesday afternoon, just in time for the full impact. Behind the scenes building the empire. During those 3 weeks, I'd also been managing the final details of the EduCorp acquisition. It wasn't just about money, it was about scale, about taking my platform from thousands of students to millions. We need to discuss the transition timeline, Sarah Chen, EduCorp's Director of Acquisitions, had said during our final negotiation call. Are you prepared to balance the consulting work with your teaching responsibilities? Teaching isn't a responsibility I'm looking to balance, I corrected. It's the foundation of everything we've built. I plan to maintain my classroom position throughout the consulting period. Sarah had paused. That's unusual. Most entrepreneurs at your level are eager to step away from their original careers. I'm not most entrepreneurs, I replied. EduVision succeeds because we never lose sight of the human beings our technology serves. The moment I stop working directly with children is the moment our products lose their authenticity. The consulting contract had been structured accordingly, allowing me to work from our local office 3 days a week while maintaining my teaching schedule. Your husband must be incredibly proud, Sarah had commented during our final call. I'd hesitated, looking at the wedding photo on my desk. He'll be surprised. This has been something of a secret project. Secret? How do you secretly build a $20 million company? It was a fair question. How had I managed 15 years of product development, investor meetings, and market expansion without my husband knowing? The answer was both simple and devastating, because he'd never been curious enough to look deeper. The return of preparation for revelation. The morning of Robert's scheduled return, I'd woken early and prepared our house like a stage set. The business journal was sitting on our front doorstep as arranged. My laptop was open on the kitchen table, displaying the tech blog article that had gone live at midnight. I dressed carefully in one of my better teaching outfits, professional but approachable. The goal wasn't to intimidate, but to reveal who I'd been all along. The newspaper article was beautifully laid out, with images showcasing both my classroom work and business achievements. The headline read, "From Classroom to Boardroom, Local Teachers Tech Company Acquired for $20 million." My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Article looks perfect. Ready for today? I typed back. As ready as I'll ever be. The sound of car doors slamming announced their return. I heard Robert's key in the front door, followed by his voice. Margaret, we're back. Then came the sound I'd been anticipating, the rustling of him picking up the newspaper, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Mom. His voice cracked. You need to see this. The confrontation present day continued. I walked slowly toward the foyer, giving Robert time to process what he was seeing. Through the window, I could see Patricia climbing out of their rental car, her designer vacation outfit wrinkled from travel. What is it? Patricia demanded, snatching the newspaper from Robert's hands before he could explain. I watched her face transform as she saw my photograph on the front page as she read the headline that shattered 22 years of assumptions. This is some kind of joke, she managed to say, her voice strangled. Robert, tell me this is a joke. William, still struggling with luggage, looked up with confusion. At 78, he'd learned to avoid his wife's dramatic moments, but even he could sense something significant was happening. It's not a joke, I said calmly, stepping into the foyer. Welcome back. How was the royal suite? The words hit Patricia like a physical blow. She staggered, gripping the newspaper so tightly her knuckles went white. You knew about the upgrade? I knew about all of it, I replied, pulling out my phone and showing her the banking app. $57,000 total, including the suite upgrade and that lovely dinner at the Bay House. The champagne alone cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. Robert was staring at me as if he'd never seen me before. Margaret, what is this? $20 million? I don't understand. What this is, I said, taking the newspaper from Patricia's shaking hands, is the truth I've been keeping from you for 15 years. Eduvision Technologies, the company I built from our garage while you slept upstairs, was acquired last week for $20 million. The silence that followed was broken only by William finally getting their suitcases through the door. He looked around at the frozen tableau and seemed to understand immediately that their family dynamics had just undergone a seismic shift. Well, he said mildly, this is interesting. Patricia whirled on him. Interesting? William, she's been lying to us for years. Have I? I asked quietly. I'm still a teacher. I still grade papers every night. I still worry about my students' progress. I just happen to also build a successful business. Which part of that is a lie? You let us think, Patricia started, then stopped, perhaps realizing that finishing that sentence would require admitting what she actually thought about me. I let you think what you wanted to think, I corrected. I never claimed to be struggling financially. You assumed that teaching was beneath your family's standards, and I chose not to correct your assumptions. Robert found his voice again. But why? Why keep it secret? Because I knew how you'd all react, I said simply. I knew Patricia would try to take credit or control it. I knew you'd worry more about managing my success than celebrating it. And I knew that revealing it would require acknowledging that neither of you had ever really bothered to know who I was. The truth hung between us like a chasm. 22 years of family dinners where I'd been dismissed and diminished, while Robert sat silently and allowed it to happen. I didn't know, he whispered. You didn't want to know, I corrected. There's a difference. The sister arrives. The sound of another car interrupted the tense moment. Through the window, I could see Susan getting out of her sedan, her expression shifting to concern as she took in the scene through her front windows. Mom, you left your phone in my car, she called out, walking up our steps. But she stopped when she saw us frozen in the foyer. Oh, they know now. Patricia spun to face her daughter. You knew about this? Susan shrugged, walking over to stand beside me. I figured it out about 2 years ago. Unlike some people, I actually paid attention to Margaret over the years. I asked questions. And you didn't tell us? Robert asked, betrayal in his voice. Tell you what? Susan shot back. That your wife is brilliant and successful? Why would I need to tell you something you should have discovered yourself by being curious about the woman you married? The criticism hit Robert visibly. He slumped against the doorframe, the full weight of his ignorance beginning to sink in. Margaret, he said quietly, I'm sorry. I should have. Should have what? I interrupted. Should have asked about my work? Should have defended me when your mother criticized my career? Should have consulted me before spending $60,000? Which part are you sorry about, Robert? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. We both knew the list was too long for a simple apology. The ultimatum. I walked to my desk and returned with a folder. Robert, you have a choice to make. He looked at the folder with growing alarm. What is that? Divorce papers, I said simply. I had them drawn up after I saw the withdrawal notification. You can sign them and walk away with exactly what you thought I was worth, a modest settlement based on a teacher's salary. Or what? He asked, his voice barely audible. Or we start over. Marriage counseling, individual therapy for you to address your relationship with your mother, and a complete restructuring of how we make decisions. But if we try to rebuild this relationship, it will be as equal partners. I won't go back to being invisible in my own marriage. Robert looked at the divorce papers, then at his parents, then back at me. I could see the calculations in his head, the weight of what each choice would cost him. The counseling, he said finally. I want to try counseling. Then you need to make your first independent decision as an adult, I said, handing him my phone with Dr. Martinez's number displayed. Call her now. Make the appointment. And don't mention what your mother thinks about therapy. Patricia started to protest, but William placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Patricia, he said quietly, I think we need to go home now. She began. Now, William repeated, his tone carrying rare authority. We need to let them work this out. As they gathered their things, Susan lingered. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I'm proud of you, Margaret. Someone needed to shake things up. After they left, Robert and I stood alone in our foyer. The newspaper articles spread between us like evidence in a trial. 22 years, he said finally. 22 years of marriage, and I never really knew who you were. You knew who you needed me to be, I replied. The question is whether you can handle knowing who I actually am. 6 months later, the therapy sessions, Dr. Martinez's office had become as familiar as my own classroom over the following months. The first session had been exactly as uncomfortable as I'd expected, with Robert and me sitting on opposite ends of her couch like adversaries. What brings you here today? Dr. Martinez had asked, and before either of us could respond, my phone had buzzed with another message from Patricia. I'd silenced it without reading. That's part of the problem, Robert had said, pointing at my phone. Mom's called me 37 times since yesterday. She's convinced Margaret planned this whole revelation to humiliate our family. Didn't you? He'd added, turning to me. No, Robert. I planned it to make you see the truth, I'd replied, facing Dr. Martinez. My husband emptied our joint account to take his parents on a luxury vacation without discussing it with me because he assumed we needed the money. How was I supposed to know my wife was secretly a millionaire? Robert had exploded. That's not the point. I'd shot back. You shouldn't empty joint accounts whether your wife makes minimum wage or runs a Fortune 500 company. Dr. Martinez had held up her hand. Robert, why did you feel you couldn't discuss this with Margaret? He deflated slightly. Mom said Margaret wouldn't understand, that she'd try to stop us because she's always been financially conservative. You mean poor, I'd translated. That's what Patricia always implied, right? Before Robert could respond, the door had burst open. Patricia had stood there, face flushed. How did you find us? Robert had jumped up. Your secretary told me where to find you, she'd said, glaring at me. I won't let you manipulate my son like this. Ma'am, this is a private session, Dr. Martinez had stood. Private? Patricia had laughed shrilly. Like how she privately built an empire while pretending to be a humble teacher? I didn't pretend anything, I'd said calmly. I am a teacher. I'm also successful. The only humiliation came from your own assumptions. Mom, you need to leave, Robert had said quietly. Patricia had frozen. What? Leave? His voice had grown stronger. This is between me and my wife. For once in my life, let me handle something without your interference. Patricia had staggered back as if slapped. I only wanted what's best for you. No, Robert had shaken his head. You wanted what's best for you. What looked best for you? Margaret was right. I need to make my own decisions. After Patricia left, Dr. Martinez had cleared her throat. Well, that was unexpected but possibly breakthrough material. Curtis, how do you feel? He'd sat back down, closer to me this time. Terrified, relieved, like I can finally breathe. Margaret? Dr. Martinez had turned to me. Your thoughts? I'm proud of him, I'd said honestly. That's the man I married. He just got lost somewhere along the way. My phone had buzzed with a message from Susan. Mom's having a meltdown. Dad's trying to calm her down. Also, I just read the full Forbes article. You're amazing. Can I see your phone? Robert had asked suddenly. I'd handed it to him, watching as he blocked his mother's number. Then he'd taken out his own phone and done the same. I need space, he'd explained. From her, from all of it. I need to figure out who I am without her voice in my head. Dr. Martinez had nodded approvingly. That's very insightful, Robert. I think it's a start, I'd said, but we have a lot to work through. Robert had reached for my hand. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one anyway. Because I love you, he'd said simply. Not your money, not your success, though I'm incredibly proud of you. I love the woman who grades papers until midnight, who lights up when her students understand a concept, who builds something amazing while staying true to herself. I just forgot to show it. Dr. Martinez had smiled. This is good progress, but there's a lot of work ahead. Are you both committed to this? I looked at Robert, really looked at him, the man who just stood up to his mother for the first time in his life, the man who was finally choosing me. Yes, I'd said, but no more secrets from either of us. Deal? He'd squeezed my hand. 3 months later, family reconciliation. We'd felt ready to attempt a family dinner after months of therapy. Susan had offered to host, providing neutral ground for what we all knew would be a delicate reintroduction. Patricia had looked different, smaller somehow, less imperious. The confidence that had once seemed unshakable had been replaced by something that looked like humility. Margaret, Robert, she'd said quietly when she opened the door. Please come in. The dining room had been set beautifully. William had already been seated, looking older but more present, as if Patricia's crisis had somehow freed him to engage more fully. Before we start, Patricia had said, her voice unusually hesitant, I have something for you, Margaret. She'd handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and receipts from Lincoln Elementary School District. I donated to your school district, she'd explained, her voice barely above a whisper. For the technology lab. I thought. I thought it might be a way to show that I understand now. About the importance of education. About why you teach. The gesture had brought tears to my eyes, not because of the money, but because it represented Patricia's first genuine attempt to understand my world. There's more. William had added gently. Tell them, Patricia. Patricia had twisted her napkin nervously, a gesture I'd never seen from the usually composed woman. I've been volunteering at the Adult Literacy Center downtown, teaching reading to adults who never learned properly as children. It's humbling and rewarding. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who'd spent years dismissing my teaching career was now discovering the profound satisfaction of helping others learn. I was wrong, she continued, her voice growing stronger. About so many things. About you. About what success looks like. About what strength looks like. I thought I was protecting Robert by ensuring he married someone who wouldn't overshadow him. Instead, I was diminishing someone extraordinary. It was the apology I'd never expected to receive, and it meant more than any financial gesture could have. Susan had raised her glass. To new beginnings. Actually, Robert had stood up before we could toast. I have news too. He'd pulled out his phone, showing an email. I quit the firm today. I'd stared at him. What? I'm starting my own practice. Smaller, focused on helping educational startups with legal work, he'd smiled at me. Someone inspired me to follow my own path. Patricia had started to speak, then stopped herself. She'd taken a deep breath. That's wonderful, darling. Tell us more about your plans. As Robert had outlined his vision, I'd watched Patricia carefully controlling her natural instinct to take over. She was trying, really trying. You're being quiet, Susan had nudged me. Just taking it all in, I'd said. A year ago, I was hiding my success to keep the peace. Now Robert's changing careers and your mother is volunteering at a literacy center. Now you're changing education globally, William had raised his glass, while teaching my wife about humility and my son about courage. I'd say that's worth celebrating. To Margaret, Robert had said, standing, who taught me that true strength isn't in what you hide, but in what you choose to reveal. To family, Patricia had added softly, and learning to do better. My phone had buzzed one final time, an email confirming the latest quarterly results from EduCorp's integration of my platform. Millions of students were now benefiting from adaptive learning technology, but I'd silenced it without checking. Some things could wait. Right now, watching Robert beam with pride about his new venture, seeing Patricia genuinely try to change, feeling Susan's supportive presence, this was enough. 1 year later, the new normal. The autumn breeze rustled through the courtyard as I wrapped up my outdoor class session. My students were presenting their projects on renewable energy, their enthusiasm infectious as they explained solar panel configurations and wind turbine designs. Mrs. Thompson, one of my students, called out, "Is your husband coming today?" I smiled, watching Robert walk across the school grounds carrying 2 cups of coffee. He'd started joining me for lunch once a week, genuinely interested in my work and respected by my colleagues as a partner rather than a patron. Yes, that's him, I confirmed. The one who didn't know I was a successful entrepreneur for 15 years. The students giggled. My story had become something of a local legend, and I'd learned to embrace the humor in it rather than feeling embarrassed. Robert reached us, handing me my coffee with a grin that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him 25 years earlier. The very same, though in my defense, she's very good at keeping secrets. Not anymore, I said, taking a sip and gathering my materials. Class dismissed. Remember, your presentations continue tomorrow. As my students dispersed, Robert sat beside me on the bench where I'd spent countless lunch breaks over the years. How was the EduCorp meeting? He asked, showing genuine interest in the details of my work. Productive. They want to expand into international markets, and they're asking me to lead the educational advisory board for the European rollout. That's incredible. Are you interested? It was such a simple question, but it represented everything that had changed in our relationship. Robert was asking about my preferences, my career goals, my professional aspirations, not making assumptions. I think so, I said honestly. It would mean some travel, maybe a few months in London to establish pilot programs. We'll figure it out, Robert said, squeezing my hand. Whatever you decide, we'll make it work. The casual confidence in his voice, the assumption that we were partners in solving problems rather than adversaries in a negotiation, still caught me off guard sometimes. 2 years of therapy and conscious effort had transformed not just our marriage, but our fundamental approach to life. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Literacy Center graduation today. 12 new readers. Thought you'd want to know. I showed Robert the message, both of us smiling at his mother's transformation. The woman who'd once dismissed my career was now texting me heart emojis about adult education victories. She's become a different person, Robert observed. Or maybe she's become who she was always meant to be. It was a generous interpretation and probably accurate. Patricia's need to diminish others had been rooted in her own insecurities. Learning to teach others, to serve rather than control, had given her a sense of purpose she'd never found in managing her family's lives. Ready for dinner tonight? I asked. We were having our monthly family dinner at Susan's house, a tradition that had replaced the tense gatherings at Patricia's formal dining room. Looking forward to it, Robert replied. Did I tell you Mom's bringing someone from the Literacy Center? She wants us to meet one of her star students. The enthusiasm in his voice would have been unimaginable 2 years ago. The Robert who'd been so desperate for his mother's approval was now genuinely excited to celebrate her independent achievements. How do you feel about everything? I asked, a question we'd learned to ask each other regularly during our therapy process. About the changes, about where we are now. Robert considered the question seriously. Grateful, he said finally. Relieved. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't forced the issue, if you just kept hiding your success. What do you think would have happened? I think we would have slowly grown apart until we were strangers living in the same house, he said quietly. I think I would have spent my whole life wondering why I felt so empty without ever understanding that I'd never really known my wife. It was a sobering thought, but probably accurate. The pattern of concealment and assumption that had characterized our relationship couldn't have continued indefinitely. Do you ever regret it? Robert asked. The way you revealed everything, the shock, the drama? I thought about his question as we walked toward our car. I regret the pain it caused, I said finally. I regret that it took a crisis to make us honest with each other. But I don't regret the outcome. Sometimes truth requires disruption, Robert. Sometimes the only way to fix something broken is to acknowledge how broken it really is. He nodded, unlocking the car door for me, a small courtesy that had taken on new meaning since we'd started rebuilding our relationship with intentional respect. I used to think marriage was about keeping the peace, avoiding conflict. Now I understand it's about choosing to face difficult truths together. As we drove home through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, I reflected on how different this life felt from the one I'd been living just 2 years ago. The external circumstances were largely the same house, same job, same community, but the internal landscape had been completely transformed. I was no longer hiding my achievements or diminishing my success to make others comfortable. Robert was no longer deferring to his mother's judgment or avoiding difficult conversations. We were finally living as the people we'd always had the potential to be. That evening, full circle, Susan's house was filled with warm chaos when we arrived. She decorated beautifully, creating the kind of welcoming atmosphere that had been missing from our formal family dinners for years. Patricia was already there, animated in conversation with a woman I didn't recognize, presumably the literacy center student she wanted us to meet. The transformation in Patricia's demeanor was striking. Instead of holding court as she'd done for decades, she was genuinely listening, asking questions, showing interest in someone else's story. Margaret, Robert. She called out warmly when she saw us. Come meet Maria. She's one of our success stories at the Literacy Center. Maria turned out to be a woman in her 50s who'd immigrated to the United States 15 years earlier, but had never learned to read English fluently. Patricia had been working with her for 8 months, and Maria had just passed her GED exam. Mrs. Patricia is the best teacher, Maria said, her face glowing with pride. She never makes me feel stupid for not knowing things. She says everyone learns different, and that's okay. I caught Robert's eye and saw my own amazement reflected there. Patricia, who'd spent years dismissing individualized instruction, was now practicing exactly the kind of patient, adaptive teaching that had inspired my platform. That's wonderful, I said sincerely. Congratulations on your GED. That's a huge accomplishment. I want to go to community college now, Maria said shyly. Maybe study to be a teacher's aide. Mrs. Patricia says I would be good at helping other people learn. The conversation continued over dinner, with Patricia genuinely excited to share stories from the Literacy Center and ask thoughtful questions about my work with EduCorp. The woman who'd once seen education as beneath her social status was now passionate about learning and teaching. I've been thinking about your adaptive learning platform, Patricia said as we cleared dishes. Would it work for adult learners? Some of our students struggle with traditional approaches. It was exactly the kind of question I'd hoped to hear from her for years. Technically informed, educationally focused, genuinely curious rather than dismissive. Actually, yes, I replied, excited to discuss possibilities. We've been exploring adult education applications. The principles are the same: meet learners where they are, adapt to their individual needs. Patricia's eyes lit up. Could you come speak to our volunteer coordinators sometime? I think they'd be fascinated to learn about personalized instruction. 2 years ago, the idea of Patricia asking me to share my expertise would have been unthinkable. Now it felt like the natural evolution of our relationship, built on mutual respect rather than hierarchical assumptions. I'd be honored, I said, meaning it completely. As the evening wound down, I found myself reflecting on the journey we'd all taken. The crisis that had threatened to destroy our family had ultimately revealed the potential for growth that had been dormant for decades. Your mother invited me to speak at the Literacy Center, I told Robert as we prepared to leave. That's incredible, he replied, genuine enthusiasm in his voice. 2 years ago, she thought teaching was a waste of your potential. Now she's asking you to train other educators. People can change, I said, though I still found Patricia's transformation remarkable. I never thought I was capable of standing up to her, Robert admitted, or of prioritizing our marriage over her expectations. But crisis has a way of revealing possibilities you didn't know existed. He was right. The revelation of my hidden success had forced all of us to confront assumptions we'd been carrying for decades. Patricia had discovered that her worth wasn't dependent on controlling others. Robert had learned that independence from his mother didn't mean losing her love. And I had found the courage to live as my complete self, without hiding the parts that made others uncomfortable. Final reflection. As we drove home that night, I thought about the teacher who'd started coding in her garage 15 years ago, driven by frustration with one-size-fits-all education. I thought about the wife who'd hidden her success to preserve family harmony, gradually losing herself in the process. I thought about the moment when I'd finally chosen truth over peace, revelation over concealment. The cost had been significant: months of therapy, family upheaval, the painful work of rebuilding trust. But the reward had been even greater: a marriage based on genuine partnership, a family built on authentic relationships, and the freedom to live without secrets. Thank you, Robert said quietly as we pulled into our driveway. For what? For not giving up on us, he said. For believing we could change, even when I didn't believe it myself. I squeezed his hand. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, I said, echoing thoughts I'd had many times over the past 2 years. Sometimes it's giving people the chance to become who they should have been all along. And sometimes, Robert added, it's having the courage to become who you were meant to be, even when it's terrifying. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, looking at our house, the same structure where we'd lived for over 2 decades, but now truly our home in ways it had never been before. Inside, I knew, were the remnants of our old life, the photo albums chronicling years of forced smiles at family gatherings, the separate bank statements that had once hidden my success, the careful facade I'd maintained for so long. But there were also signs of our new beginning. Joint financial accounts with full transparency, Robert's law books for his new practice focused on educational startups, and the newspaper article about my acquisition prominently framed in our living room. The article had been more than just a revelation of hidden success. It had been a declaration of independence, a refusal to remain small when I was meant to shine. It had been the beginning of our second chance, earned through honesty, therapy, and the difficult work of learning to see each other clearly. As we walked into our house together, I felt genuinely at peace for the first time in years. Success, I'd learned, wasn't just about building something valuable, it was about building it on your own terms, and then choosing to share it with people who truly valued both your accomplishments and your heart. Tomorrow I would return to my classroom, where I'd continue teaching third graders while also guiding the international expansion of educational technology that would reach millions of students worldwide. Robert would continue building his practice, supporting educational innovation while finally pursuing his own professional passions. And Patricia would return to the Literacy Center, discovering daily that the greatest success comes not from controlling others, but from empowering them. We were all different people than we'd been 2 years ago, shaped by crisis and transformed by the choice to face truth together. The quiet teacher had found her voice. The dominated son had discovered his independence. The controlling mother had learned the joy of service. And our family had been rebuilt on a foundation strong enough to support who we really were, rather than who we pretended to be. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest decision: to stop hiding and start living as your authentic self. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people you love is the chance to know who you really are. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they'll have the courage to show you who they really are in return.